Continuing chapter 13, the Trojan War. Achilles was kept back by his mother. The sea nymph knew that if he went to Troy, he was fated to die there. She sent him to the court of Lycomedes, the king who had treacherously killed Theseus and made him wear women's clothes and hide among the maidens. Odysseus was dispatched by the chieftains to find him out. Disguised as a peddler, he went to the court where the lad was said to be, with joyous ornaments in his pack, such as women love, and also some fine weapons. While the girls, young women I'm sure, flocked around the trinkets. Or maybe it was their younger daughters, I'm not sure what they mean. In Greek it's actually clear. Achilles fingered the swords and daggers. Odysseus knew him then, and he had no trouble at all in making him disregard what his mother had said and go to the Greek camp with him. So the great fleet made ready. 1,000 ships carried the Greek host. They met at Aulis, a place of strong winds and dangerous tides, impossible to sail from as long as the north wind blew. And as it kept on blowing day after day, it broke men's heart, spared not ship nor cable. The time dragged, doubling itself and passing. The army was desperate. At last, the soothsayer Calchas declared that the entities had spoken to him. Artemis was angry. One of her beloved wild creatures, a hare, had been slain by the Greeks together with her young, and the only way to calm the wind and ensure a safe voyage to Troy was to appease her by sacrificing to her a royal maiden, Iphigenia, the eldest daughter of the commander-in-chief, Agamemnon. This was terrible to all, but to her father hardly bearable. If I must slay the joy of my house, my daughter, a father's hands, stained with dark streams flowing from blood of a girl slaughtered before the altar. Nevertheless, he yielded. His reputation with the army was at stake, and his ambition to conquer Troy and exalt Greece. The human sacrifice or killing or far less things should never be done. Just, what my reputation will be injured if I don't do this. It's like, to this day, he dared the deed, slaying his child to help a war. He sent home for her, writing his wife that he had arranged a great marriage for her to Achilles, who had already shown himself the best and greatest of all chieftains. But when she came to her wedding, she was carried to the altar to be killed. And all her prayers, cries of Father, Father, her maiden life, these they held as nothing. The savage warriors, battle mad. She died, and the north wind ceased to blow, and the Greek ships sailed over a quiet sea. But the evil price they had paid was bound some day to bring evil down upon them. When they reached the mouth of the Simois, one of the rivers of Troy, the first man to leap ashore was Protesilaus. It was a brave deed, for the oracle had said that he who landed first would be the first to die. Therefore, when he had fallen by a Trojan spear, the Greeks paid him honors as though he were divine, and those they considered gods, too. Greatly distinguished him. They had Hermes bring him up from the dead to see once again his deeply mourning wife, Laodamia. She would not give him up a second time, however, When he went back to the underworld, she went with him. She killed herself. Always regard the future before doing such things, you know? And, don't do those things. The 1,000 ships carried a great host of fighting men, and the Greek army was very strong. But the Trojan city was strong too. Priam, the king, and his queen, Hecuba, had many brave sons to lead the attack and to defend the walls, one above all, Hector, then, whom no man anywhere was nobler or more brave, and only a great warrior, the champion of the Greeks, Achilles. Each knew that he would die before Troy was taken. Achilles had been told by his mother, "Very brave is your lot. Would that you could be free now from tears and troubles, for you shall not long endure, my child, short-lived beyond all men and to be pitied." No one considered to be a divinity had told Hector, but he was equally sure. "I know well in my heart and in my soul," he said to his wife, Andromache, "the day shall come when holy Troy will be laid low, and Priam and Priam's people, both heroes, fought under the shadow of certain death. For 9 years victory wavered, now to this side, now to that. Neither was ever able to gain any decided advantage. Then a quarrel flared up between the two Greeks, Achilles and Agamemnon, and for a time it turned the tide in favor of the Trojans. Again, a woman was the reason. Chryseis, daughter of Apollo's priest, whom the Greeks had carried off and given to Agamemnon. Her father came to beg for her release, but Agamemnon would not let her go. Then the priest prayed to the mighty entity he served, and Phoebus Apollo heard him. From his sun chariot he shot fiery arrows down upon the Greek army, and men sickened and died, so that the funeral pyres were burning continually. At last Achilles called an assembly of the chieftains. He told them that they could not hold out against both the pestilence and the Trojans, and they that must either find a way to appease Apollo or else sail home. Sorry, it's been smokier here the past couple days than. Then the prophet Calchas stood up and said he knew why the entity was angry, but he was afraid to speak unless Achilles would guarantee his safety. "I do so," Achilles answered, "even if you accuse Agamemnon himself." Every man there understood what that meant. They knew how Apollo's priest had been treated when Calchas declared that Chryseis must be given back to her father, he had all the chiefs behind him, and Agamemnon, greatly angered, was obliged to agree. "But if I lose her, who was my prize of honor," he told Achilles, "I will have another in her stead." Therefore, when Chryseis had been returned to her father, Agamemnon sent 2 of his squires to Achilles' tent to take his prize of honor away from him. The maiden Chryseis, most unwillingly, they went and stood before the hero in heavy silence. But he, knowing their errand, told them it was not they who were wronging him. Well, except that it was, right? Let them take the girl without fear for themselves, but hear him first, while he swore before the entities and men that Agamemnon would pay dearly for the deed. That night, Achilles' mother Silver-footed Thetis, the sea nymph, came to him. She was angry as he. She told him to have nothing more to do with the Greeks, and with that she went up to heaven and asked Zeus to give success to the Trojans. Zeus was very reluctant. The war by now had reached Olympus. The entities were ranged against each other. Aphrodite, of course, was on the side of Paris. Equally, of course, Hera and Athena were against him. Ares, entity of war, always took sides with Aphrodite. When Poseidon, lord of the sea, favored the Greeks, a sea people, always great sailors, Apollo cared for Hector, and for his sake helped the Trojans, and Artemis and his sister did so too. Zeus liked the Trojans best on the whole, but he wanted to be neutral because Hera was so disagreeable whenever he opposed her openly. However, he could not resist Thetis. He had a hard time with Hera, who guessed, as she usually did, what he was about. He was driven, finally, into telling her that he would lay hands upon her if she did not stop talking. Hera kept silence then, but her thoughts were busy as to how she might help the Greeks and circumvent Zeus. The plan Zeus made was simple. He knew that the Greeks, without Achilles, were inferior to the Trojans, and he sent a lying dream to Agamemnon promising victory if he attacked. So according to this, Zeus is a devil, right? Or perhaps it's the person lying about what to themselves about what the dream is really about, right? While Achilles stayed in his tent, a fierce battle followed, the hardest yet fought. Up on the wall of Troy, the old king Priam and the other old men, wise in the ways of war, sat watching the contest. To them came Helen, the cause of all that agony and death, yet as they looked at her, they could not feel any blame. Men must fight for such as she, they said to each other, for her face was like to that of an immortal spirit. She stayed by them, telling them the names of this and that Greek hero, until, their astonishment, the battle ceased. The armies drew back on either side, and on the space between Paris and Menelaus faced each other. It was evident that the sensible decision had been reached to let the two most concerned fight it out alone. Paris struck first, but Menelaus caught the swift spear on his shield, then hurled his own. It rent Paris's tunic, but did not wound him. Menelaus drew his sword, his only weapon now, but as he did so, it fell from his hand, broken. Undaunted, though unarmed, he leapt upon Paris, and seizing him by his helmet's crest, that feather brush thing, swung him off his feet. He would have dragged him to the Greeks victoriously if it had not been for Aphrodite. She tore away the strap that kept the helmet on, so that it came away, and Menelaus's hand, Paris himself, who had not fought at all except to throw his spear, she caught up in a cloud and took back to Troy. Furiously, Menelaus went through the Trojan ranks, seeking Paris, and not a man there but would have helped him, for they all hated Paris. But he was gone. No one knew how or where, so Agamemnon spoke to both armies, declaring that Menelaus was victor, and bidding the Trojans give Helen back. This was just, and the Trojans would have agreed if Athena, at Hera's prompting, had not interfered. Hera was determined that the war should not end until Troy was ruined. Athena, sweeping down to the battlefield, persuaded the foolish heart of Pandarus, a Trojan, to break the truce and shoot an arrow at Menelaus. He did so and wounded him only slightly, but the Greeks, in rage at the treachery, turned upon the Trojans, and the battle was on again. Terror and destruction and strife, whose fury never slackens, all friends of the murderous war entity were there to urge men on to slaughter each other. Then the voice of groaning was heard, and the voice of triumph from slayer and from slain, and the earth streamed with blood. Of just conquest and that sort of thing, just kind of makes some war entities sound like evil. But war in itself, if it's defense of your own rights and defense of the innocent, in actuality, that's different, On the Greek side, with Achilles gone, the two greatest champions were Ajax and Diomedes. They fought gloriously that day, and many a Trojan lay on his face in the dust before them. The best and bravest, next to Hector, the prince Aeneas, came near to death at Diomedes' hands. He was of more than royal blood. His mother was Aphrodite herself, and when Diomedes wounded him, she hastened down to the battlefield to save him. She lifted him in her soft arms, but Diomedes, knowing she was a cowardly female entity, not one of those who, like Athena, are masters where warriors fight, leapt toward her and wounded her hand. Well, there's different types of bravery, so saying, oh, this woman's not into battle and all that, doesn't mean that she, is a coward. Thus proving that the Greeks were not people that, they worshipped all these entities, or projected a bunch of other female, ideas that weren't actual entities. But they were still rather sexist. Men and women, you can say they're inherently equal, but different. Crying out, she let Aeneas fall, and weeping for pain, made her way to Olympus, where Zeus, smiling to see the laughter-loving female entity, in tears bade her stay away from battle and remember hers were the works of love and not of war. But although his mother failed him, Aeneas was not killed. Apollo enveloped him in a cloud and carried him to sacred Pergamos, the holy place of Troy, where Artemis healed him of his wound. But Diomedes raged on, working havoc in the Trojan ranks until he came face to face with Hector. There, to his dismay, he saw Ares too. The blood-stained, murderous entity of war was fighting for Hector. At the sight, Diomedes shuddered and cried to the Greeks to fall back, slowly, however, with their faces toward the Trojans. Now, a lot of people, if they do see a djinn, they are, wholly other, and, a person might consider such an entity to be a god if one saw it. So, most people don't see it because maybe they can't, maybe they'd be unable to choose otherwise. Then Hera was angry. She urged her horses to Olympus and asked Zeus if she might drive that bane of men, Ares, from the battlefield. Zeus, who loved him no more than Hera did, even though he was their son, willingly gave her leave. She hastened down to stand beside Diomedes and urge him to smite the terrible entity and have no fear. At that, joy filled the hero's heart. He rushed at Ares and hurled his spear at him. Athena drove it home, and it entered Ares's body. The war entity bellowed as loud as 10,000 cry in battle, and at the awful sound, trembling, seized the whole host, Greeks and Trojans alike. Ares, really a bully at heart, and unable to bear what he brought upon unnumbered multitudes of men, fled up to Zeus in Olympus and complained bitterly of Athena's violence. But Zeus looked at him sternly and told him he was as intolerable as his mother, and bade him cease his whining. With Ares gone, however, the Trojans were forced to fall back. At this crisis, a brother of Hector's, wise in discerning the will of the entities, urged Hector to go with all speed to the city and tell the queen, his mother, to offer to Athena the most beautiful robe she owned, and pray her to have mercy. Hector felt the wisdom of the advice and sped through the gates to the palace, where his mother did all as he said. She took a robe so precious that it shone like a star, and laying it on the female entity's knees, she besought her, Lady Athena, spare the city, and the wives of the Trojans, and the little children. But Pallas Athena denied the prayer. Now, we could say that possibly those being talked about as gods and goddesses, with the Trojan War in particularly, could have been people back at that time. Basically, the nobles were really the ones that the war was about, not the people, Sort of a high society dispute. As Hector went back to the battle, he turned aside to see once more, perhaps for the last time, the wife he tenderly loved, Andromache, and his son, Astyanax. Or at least, if there was multiple conquerings of Troy, that, at least in one of those instances, right? Astyanax. He met her on the wall, where she had gone in terror to watch the fighting. When she heard the Trojans were in retreat, with her was a handmaid carrying the little boy. Hector smiled and looked at them silently, but Andromache took his hand in hers and wept. My dear lord, she said, you who are father and mother and brother unto me, as well as husband, stay here with us. Do not make me a widow and your child an orphan. He refused her gently. He could not be a coward, he said. It was for him to fight, always in the forefront of the battle. Yet she could know that he never forgot what her anguish would be when he died. That was the thought that troubled him above all else. More than his many other cares, he turned to leave her, but first he held out his arms to his son. Terrified, the little boy shrank back, afraid of the helmet and its fierce nodding crest. Hector laughed and took the shining helmet from his head. Then, holding the child in his arms, he caressed him and prayed, O Zeus, in after years, may men say of this my son, when he returns from battle, far greater is he than his father was. And let us remember that when it comes to Zeus in particular, we can actually say that Zeus is a deity name that you could take beyond things like personification and gender and stuff like this. Dies Pieter and the Hindu origin. Sanskrit, whatever. So he laid the boy in his wife's arms, and she took him, smiling yet with tears. And Hector pitied her, and touched her tenderly with his hand, and spoke to her, Dear one, be not so sorrowful. That which is fated must come to pass. But against my fate no man can kill me. Then taking up his helmet, he left her, and she went to her house, often looking back at him and weeping bitterly. Once again on the battlefield, he was eager for the fight, and better fortunate for a time lay before him. Zeus had by now remembered his promise to the Thetis to avenge Achilles' wrong. He ordered all other immortals to stay at Olympus. He himself went down to earth to help the Trojans. Then it went hard with the Greeks. Their great champion was far away. Achilles sat alone in his tent, brooding over his wrongs. The great Trojan champion had never before shown himself so brilliant and so brave. Hector seemed irresistible, tamer of horses, so Trojans always called him, and he drove his car through the Greek ranks. You know, the chariot pulled by horses. As if the same spirit animated steeds and driver. His glancing helm was everywhere, and one gallant warrior after another fell beneath his terrible bronze spear. When evening ended the battle, the Trojans had driven the Greeks back almost to their ships. There was rejoicing in Troy that night, but grief and despair in the Greek camp. Agamemnon himself was all for giving up and sailing back to Greece. Nestor, however, who was the oldest among the chieftains and therefore the wisest, wiser even than the shrewd Odysseus, spoke out boldly and told Agamemnon that if he had not angered Achilles, they would not have been defeated. Try to find some way of appeasing him, he said, instead of going home disgraced. All applauded the advice, and Agamemnon confessed that he had acted like a fool. He would send Briseis back. He promised them with her many other splendid gifts, and he begged Odysseus to take his offer to Achilles. Odysseus and the two chieftains chosen to accompany him found the hero with his friend Patroclus, who of all men on earth was dearest to him. Achilles welcomed them courteously and set food and drink before them. But when they told him why they had come, and all the rich gifts that would be his if he would yield, and begged him to have pity on his hard-pressed countrymen, they received an absolute refusal. Not all the treasures of Egypt could buy him, he told them. He was sailing home, and they would be wise to do the same. And I guess one more program with this chapter.